Well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Collision Live. It is me, one of your hosts, Daniel Blackaby, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the angry rant to my Wendy's drive-thru window, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Oh, it's good to be with you, Daniel. Haven't gone to any Wendy's drive-thrus lately, so thankfully I don't have to get upset.
Well, you know what would make you less upset is if when you got to that drive-thru window,
A
a little earlier, there was a menu to let you.
That would solve a lot of my
That would
frustrations
solve
in
that.
life. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have ever thought of that. Just,
Right
food-
to your
food for thought.
local, your local Wendy's
Yeah,
and demand change.
Get angry. The better world starts with us. But hey, we're excited to have you guys join us for another episode of our live stream podcast. Is to get into a lot of interesting stuff in our culture, kind of approaching it as Christians as we navigate it and engage with culture, and just sort of try and keep the finger on the pulse of sort of what's going on. Encourage you guys, if you guys are joining us live, share your thoughts in the comment section, have a conversation. Even if you're not, you're a sluggard, you're coming to us 3 days late, still throw some comments in. We'd love to have a conversation about these topics and just sort of get a different perspective on how we can engage as Christians. But there is some interesting stuff going on, starting with a galaxy far, far away. So why don't we just kick things off like we always do with cultural conversations. So this is sort of a story that we've been kind of meaning to talk about for a while because, hey, we usually take that low-hanging fruit that is Star Wars, and we haven't. There hasn't been very many Star Wars stories that we've passed up to talk about.
None, in fact, I think.
And we didn't end up doing a review just because TV reviews are they're just more difficult to do, and we just didn't get around to it. So we didn't do like a full review. Although I did go one step further. I did just as of yesterday, published an article on our website.
Ink is still wet on that one.
Yeah, hot off the press, called "Spirituality and Religion in the Mandalorian." Kind of not a review of this season, but more just kind of exploring some of the kind of interesting religious themes that seem to kind of come up, even like as I was sort of watching through the season. Just sort of continually was intrigued by some of those things. I tried to kind of pull it all together and kind of look at some of it. I have seen the full season. Sam doesn't usually, his finger is only like usually half on the pulse of culture.
Yeah.
So you're not quite finished.
No, I've got about 2 episodes to go. And, I think I was just very uninspired by this season. Like, it just kind of feels a bit dull, I guess, or just uninteresting. And I think partly that's just, I don't know, like that. I think that's just kind of the nature of how they make these episodes, and they kind of just feel a little bit tired. I don't know.
Yeah,
and I think it's maybe different too, because like I would watch it by myself, whereas you're watching it with your boys, I'm assuming.
Yeah, when you're like watching your kids get excited about lore
and so I guess I'm just less motivated to like, I need to finish this season. Like I don't have that many to go, but it's just sort of like okay.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say, at least for me, I wouldn't say it was dull as much as it was just inconsistent. Like there were moments where like this is the show this could be, and like this is really good, and like then there'd be like an entire episode where you're like,
what on earth is that? Like,
I just spent an hour of my life, like, it's sort of, or just too many storylines to keep up with. So again, I wasn't exactly thrilled with this. Definitely the weakest season that they have had.
Yeah, but I will say that I was very piqued in interest by just the overt religious undertones of the whole thing. Like even from like I think episode 1, it's like, whoa, they're really leaning into this sort of the religion aspect of the Mandalorians and their creed and all that kind of stuff, and you really see the Din Djarin and what's Bo-Katan, their sort of clash, at least at the beginning, of like, this is the way versus I'm gonna kind of make my own way, but I'm still a Mandalorian. So that is very. I mean, I think that's probably the highlight of the show. Again, having not finished it, it is very interesting to see how they handle like religion and spirituality throughout. I think it's more interesting even than like the particular stories that they're telling, which maybe is not to the credit of the story.
Yeah, because it is. For me, it was refreshing to regardless of even how they unpack the religious stuff, like, you know, I don't think this is like, you know, a faith-based show now, or like, you know, like
no.
that it's necessarily like you just pin it to like, you know, Mandalorians preaching the gospel. Like, it's not that, but it's just rare. As what's his name from The Office made headlines for. Like, it's rare for Hollywood to just do like hey, religion's like an important part of like the majority of people on this planet's life.
Yeah.
But like so many stories, because it's taboo, it's like there's just like absence of religion outside of like that villain's a crazy cultist, like, you know, like, or else it's sort of the more niche, like where it's all faith and like all religion, like faith-based. But just sort of the stories that it's like, hey, this isn't like a faith-based story, but like religion's part of this world, and like if this galaxy far, far away, like religion, there'd be religions. Like, it's not a world without.
Well, and I think that's one of the many benefits of Star Wars, is because it is such a like diverse galaxy and world that Lucas built, that you can have these just really interesting things that aren't like, you can see there are obvious tiebacks to like real religions, but because it's in this, you know, fictional fantasy world, it's not as heavy. It doesn't feel necessarily as heavy-handed as it's like, oh, well, you know, this was like the Mormons, or, you know, the Buddhist or whatever, because it's in a very like fantasy-based world. I think it lessens the sort of maybe offense that religion would normally cause if it was like done in like set in our reality. Yeah,
it kind of removes it a bit from like directly, you know, this is a guy reading from the book of Revelation in the Bible, and he's obviously a weirdo, and like where it is more just like larger, more general of like faith and religion and belief in a creed and a belief system. Because even like the showrunners, Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, like just how overtly, like obviously like the thematic stuff, we can kind of get into some of that, but even like the episode titles, like just in this one season alone, the apostate, the convert, and the spies, which I don't know if you've seen the spies episode, if you got there yet.
No.
That might be the next one you're on. Like,
yeah, I think that.
Like,
I think
both me and my wife were sort of like, who are the spies? Like, is there someone undercover? And like, and then like in context later, it's like, oh, like there really wasn't one. Like, that seems weird. Like, it seems very like, in hindsight, an allusion to like they're standing there like 12 men, like the Joshua going into the promised land, like send the spy,
scope out,
like kind of Old Testament stuff. Where like, oh, like that's cool. Like that's another sort of almost missed biblical allusion. But so we'll kind of get into. We don't need to go like a super deep dive into like all this stuff, because hey, there's an article on the collision.org that will do that for you.
What a coincidence!
Which I encourage you to check out. But I think what I liked about the way that the Mandalorian did it is like, it just sort of did it, like you said, not heavy-handed, but also just more like ambiguous, or like more like on. Like, it didn't. You sort of have like the two competing, like Mando with very much like, this is the way, and like if you take your helmet off, even when you're dying, like you got to go like take a bath in Mandalore, like like very much like you're exiled, excommunicated, like. And then you have like Bo, who's very just sort of I'm a Mandalorian, but like the creeds are kind of silly, and our belief system's kind of just childish stories, and like you kind of have those two characters, and like they both sort of move around a bit within their faith system, but like the show doesn't necessarily, like, they could have very easily turned Mando into that crazy cultist of like, he needs to be enlightened now by this, like, you're stuck to all these like restrictive creeds. Like, it could have become an obvious like social, like a commentary on like Christianity and religion, and like you need to be liberated by more progressive view of faith. And like the show in some ways does the opposite.
Well, yeah, I think there is kind of a lack of an angle, I guess you could say, when it comes to portraying those two sort of sides of the religion coin, if you will. And so I think that is something I think that does feel pretty unique. That typically it's either you're coming down like pro-religion or like anti-religion, and it's pretty obvious like once you get into the story. But it is interesting that they have kind of struck a balance of not necessarily like, showing their hand as far as like, this is what the creators believe, and like are trying to get you. You don't feel like they're necessarily trying to move you in one direction or another, which I think is great. Like, I think it's just really fascinating that it's part of the story, but it's not. It doesn't feel like there's a real like messaging taking place.
'Cause you kind of see both, like, there is a sense, like, when Mando's going off to, like, have to bathe in the living waters and stuff, like, where, like, as a view, even as someone that's a Christian, like, it's like, that seems like he's, like, maybe he needs to loosen up a bit on some of the, those are sort of seem a little silly, like,
Yeah.
but then, like, there's also the sense, I think, like, in that scene where Mando tells Bo, like, you know, like, without our creeds, what are we? Like, there
Yeah.
is very much, like, all throughout this affirmation that, like, the creeds are, like, having these sort of, not restrictions as much as just, like, a code, like a way of life, like a framework for
Yeah.
how you do stuff, like, that you kind of need that. And if you sort of see the other Mandos that don't have that, kind of don't have like, they're just wandering and, like, they sort of lost their identity.
Yeah.
So you do sort of get some of that of, like, you know, hey, maybe some of this, like, hyper fundamentalist Mandalorian stuff, like, is bad, but, like, without any kind of creed or code, that's bad too. Like, they're sort
Yeah.
of both extremes.
Well, you can't live your life without a framework, I think, like even like morally and you know, religiously, even if you consider yourself not religious, like you will have some sort of framework. And I think that is, I think what it's really getting at is, like, people have to have a framework to live in, or otherwise it's just kind of just chaos and anarchy. And so I think the reality is that, like, people do need religion in some way. Even, you know, it's just gonna maybe look very different for some. And but yeah, I think it's interesting how they try and strike that balance between.
Because
the
even,
two.
like, in the article too, like, something that came to mind when watching the show is, like, the Jerusalem Council in Acts, where they're sort of, the early church is like, you know, we have Jews, we have Gentiles, but we're all Christian now, and, like, some of them get circumcised, some don't, some do this, some eat meat, some do all this. Like, there's all these disagreements, and, like, that's sort of what you see, like, in the show of, like, okay, we're all Mandalorian, like, we're all kind of part of this, but, like, what is the essentials? Like, if we're gonna survive, like, is it that you have to wear a helmet and that makes you, or, like, is that, like, a for some people but not for others, but as long as we believe this thing, like, so I don't know, you see a lot of you know, I think I liked it maybe for why some Christians might not like it as much, of that it was more kind of ambiguous, and it just sort of lets characters ask these questions and, like, work through it, and this is sort of an unexpected, you don't expect that in a Star Wars, really, from any Hollywood thing, but, like, in, you know, the best faith exploration of faith in Hollywood this year comes from a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to explore in that area, and I think Hollywood's probably waking up to that a little bit, to see, like, you know, you can explore faith and religion, I think, in a way that is not necessarily alienating of the quote unquote non-religious. And I think there is a real hunger for that, because I think people are, like, if they're not religious, they're trying to figure out what they believe anyways. And so I think there's just a lot of real interesting things that you can do and stories to explore that are exploring that very thing, that can be done in a way that I think is more interesting. And
so can you do it without being preachy, and while also not being, like, condescending, like, to either side? It says, hey, religion, belief, that's a natural part of sort of our existence. Although I will say, kind of our next segment of the show is something that has been known to be a bit preachy and at times even condescending. I set a high bar last week with my insightful host corner, so the stage is set for our next segment. We have host corner.
Well, Daniel, speaking of high bars, I can think of no higher bar than space, which is very high if you measure it quite far out. But this happened, I think, more than a week ago, but SpaceX launched the very first and most powerful rocket ever. And this is the Starship. It hit a bunch of milestones that are just super epic, and I would be remiss if we let a week pass and I didn't just sort of note this on the calendar, that, like, this we'll look back on this, I think, probably in a decade, and say this was sort of a high watermark for the progress of human flourishing among the stars. And so it hit like its max Q, even though yes, the rocket exploded. It was not a failure. Like in fact, it was like one of the biggest successes I think in rocketry, because it's like it's just hard to imagine the scale of this rocket, and just how powerful it was, and all the cool things that it did, and all the and there's going to be the crazy thing about this is like in a few months there'll be another one, and they've already like the engines that have been built for the new one have already like had thousands of like updates and changes made even before this one launched. Like just the pace of progress to do something at this scale is just really mind blowing. So I just wanted a little plug for space and aerodynamics and rocketry.
I feel like space needs a good plug now and then, just to remind us.
Hey,
that, it needs a little bit better PR sometimes. It doesn't get enough. And I do feel like the rocket is a fitting metaphor, I feel like, from just my life of like, you made progress. There's a lot of good stuff. Yes, you blew up and it kind of came crashing down to Earth, but like steps were taken.
Yeah, well,
aiming in the right direction.
The data gleaned from that launch. Yeah, I mean I think we can all sort of take a note from the space industry and just realize that things that explode after a launch is not necessarily a bad thing. Like it's good that these things happen. Obviously, nobody was on board, but the amount of stuff that you can learn from that is just infinite.
And one of the things that I think we will learn as we explore space is the question of, are we alone in the universe, or are there aliens, perhaps even extraterrestrials out there in the universe? And speaking of E.T. and those cute, depending on your subjective opinion, cute little aliens, Steven Spielberg is, Joni, I don't think was pleased with my segue, but speaking of Mr. Steven Spielberg and space and E.T., he was kind of making headlines on the socials just the other day. I think it's part of Time 100 influential people. Sadly, once again, I fell in at 101. So I keep
missed it. Next year.
Keep missing that cut. I got to be a little bit more successful. But so there's sort of been featuring all these just powerful, influential entertainers and celebrities and stuff. And most of those people, I don't really care what they have to say. Good for them for their success. But yeah. But Steven Spielberg is someone that I'm always interested to hear, just because he made Jaws for one thing. So like that's like a lifetime card to just say whatever you want, and I will sit at his feet, the feet of the master. But he had an interesting kind of clip of that interview where he talks about his movie E.T. and kind of touches on kind of a hot button kind of current event. So we're gonna play that interview clip, and then I think we can kind of jump into it as Christians.
Are there films you would edit that you would, looking back at them, something you would have done differently? Say, I as an editor, I feel that way about some Time covers, not yours. But is there a sense of, I know at one point you took some guns out of E.T. and then regretted it.
That was a mistake. That was a mistake. I never should have done that, because E.T. is a product of its era. And it's not, no film should be revised based on the lenses we now are either voluntarily or being forced to peer through. But E.T. was a film that I was sensitive to the fact that the federal agents were approaching a bunch of kids with their firearms exposed. And I thought I would change the guns into walkie-talkies. But E.T. was, and that was because years had gone by, and I had changed my own views. I should never have messed with the archive of my own work. And I don't recommend anybody really do that. Your film, all our movies are a kind of measuring, it's sort of a signpost of where we were when we made them, and what the world was like, what the world was receiving when we got those stories out there. So I really regret having done that.
You feel that way about, this is such a current topic across literature and art in general, taking certain language out of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Is this a feeling you have across the world of art, that we shouldn't apply today's standards to yesterday's work?
Nobody should ever attempt to take the chocolate out of Willy Wonka, ever. And they shouldn't take the chocolate or the vanilla or any other flavor out of anything that has been written. It is absolutely for me, it is sacrosanct. It's something that is our history. It's our cultural. It's our cultural heritage.
Warts and all.
Yeah, I do not believe in censorship that way.
So there's Mr. Spielberg
Dropping the truth bombs.
dropping some all the way from outer space. I think just sort of nailing, like, because this is, again, we talked about this a couple, well, maybe it's more than a couple weeks, a month or so ago.
Last year.
Yeah, at some point since we started doing this show, about that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and, like, updating, like the sensitivity readers that, like, go through the old books and, like, say, like, we can't handle this word or this thing. And, like, then they change it. Hasn't really been done a ton with film, I think, just because it's hard. It's easy to go back and, like, change a digital, Word document. It's harder to
There's
go
been
back.
some animated changes, haven't there?
Yeah, like Lilo
I
and
think
Stitch.
Lilo, that comes to mind. Yeah, which
forget
maybe
how-
that's slightly easier. Like, I think somebody put somebody in, like, a washing machine, I think.
Yeah, and then they changed
And they
that
were
now
like,
to,
yeah,
like, a
maybe we don't
cupboard or
want to
something.
encourage kids to, like, put their siblings in on tumble dry. I don't know, but yeah.
Hey, kids are stinky. Sometimes maybe they need the deep.
Yeah,
The deep.
it's the only way to
thing.
get them clean
The
sometimes.
2 soap pods rather than 1. So it hasn't really been done. Like, obviously, it has, and, like, 'cause Spielberg did it.
Yeah.
Again, if you're not familiar, like, he mentions it, but, like, there is in ET, like, all these police officers, and, like, they have, like, their guns out, and then, like, in, like, the anniversary, they edit it, and, like, especially if like. Because, like, they're filmed as though they have guns.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
So they're, like, shaking walkie-talkies at people, and, like, they all have walkie-talkies, like, all out in their hand. Like it looks so.
It is sort of
looks so
ridiculous.
dumb.
And I think South Park, like, sort of mocked that change too at the time. Like, I think they did a bit on it, of, like, they were watching it with all and it has, like, a disclaimer and stuff. So it's like, I mean, I think it was pretty roundly mocked.
Yeah, and, like, obviously, like, George Lucas with Star Wars changed his work more for his own ideas rather than necessarily, like, because of social stuff. Like, he just wanted to change things. But it's interesting because Spielberg, and he's Spielberg, so he can say these sort of things, and, like, I can like cancel Spielberg, like, not go to his movies anymore. Like, he's like, whatever, in his 70s, he's made, like, 50 amazing movies, so he can kind of say those sort of things. But I think it is interesting because he sort of frames it as, like, like, I think if he made E.T. today, he would make a different movie.
Probably.
But just sort of coming to peace with the fact that, like, hey, like, where we are today isn't where we were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, like, and, like, rather than just sort of be uncomfortable with the fact that we've grown, that's actually something to preserve for that reason, because it doesn't reflect today, and that's helpful, and, like, that's a signpost. I think he even says, like, that's a signpost of, like, where we've come from, and, like, we need those moments, or else there is no sense of growth. What do you take from Spielberg? Is he on the money?
Yeah, I mean, I would say he is, and I very much have that same opinion that you really shouldn't try and, like, doctor previous works of art based on today's social norms, or, like you said, the lens of today's culture, looking back on art that was made 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, because it's just sort of I think a completely wrong way to view art, whether it's literature or movies or music or whatever else, because it is that signpost of where we were at the time. I think you learn a lot about humanity when you read some of, like, the great writers throughout history. If all of them sort of used the same language or didn't use certain language that we wouldn't use today, it sort of I don't know, it just sort of, like, vanilla-izes everything, and I think it makes it much less interesting, not because it's like, oh, we want to hear offensive language or say things that are just culturally inappropriate, but I think it's because those things were written, and that's how people were thinking at the time. And so I think it's really insightful into just, the human thought process, humanity, culture at the time. And I think if everything was sort of, like, rearranged to fit into today's society, it would just lose, I think, the power of of what it was originally.
Yeah, because even like I read probably way too much like Victorian era British literature.
But it can. Well, I mean, I feel like the thing is, can someone read too much Victorian era British literature?
I mean, I'm testing that theory hard. I've gone through all the
I doubt.
Dickens, the
I
Trollope,
doubt. I doubt you'll find the limit. Like, I think.
but I'm definitely closer than I once was. But and again, because I read those books because they're amazing, and Dickens is like he's the Spielberg of his. Well, I guess Spielberg's the Dickens of his movie world. Like, it came later. But even like some of that stuff, like even if it's not necessarily like racial, like derogatory terms, like just like gender stick in Dickens and like Trollope, so it's like the sense of like female, like when you get married, like you're sort of like the servant to your like your dominating like husband, and like, sort of you have zero agency, and like which when you like read other stuff and like sort of that history, like a lot of these novels were like super progressive at their time for like how strong their female characters are. Although like if you read them through our lens today, you're like, yeah, that's a little I don't think like some of that stuff that they sort of gloss over as like, well, that's just how it is, like. But like I feel like what we've lost now is like the ability or just the willingness to like to see some of that we don't necessarily agree with and be okay with being uncomfortable and being like, I don't agree with that. Like I don't need to just not read that, or like this maybe just sort of tie at a deeper level of just like our reluctance as a culture to kind of step outside of our comfort zone and not have everything catered to us. Like how we think and how we, if it's faith-based stuff, it has to affirm just that. If it's whatever kind of other ideologies, like it has to affirm that. And like if it sort of seems like it's outdated now, like we need to go change that because, heaven forbid we read something from the past that like doesn't, wasn't written by someone 100 years later. Like,
I mean, it is just kind of insane to think like, and also the hubris to think that like we in this time now have sorted it all out and know what is best for all time to come. It's like, well, so like what are people going to say about things that are written, movies that are made now, in 50 years? I doubt it's going to be, wow, they were right. 50 years earlier, they really knew their stuff and they had everything sorted out. And boy, like, isn't that amazing how smart they were? Like, I don't know that that's going to necessarily be the case if you are writing or producing movies sort of in today's culture. I think there's going to be a lot of things that you look back on and think, whoa, like, what were they thinking in the early 2020s when, this movie came out, or when they, so-and-so wrote this book. Like, it's just, it is sort of insane to think that now we know, and like we will always know, because that's sort of what you're saying. It's like what we know now is better than what we knew then, and it's going to take us into the future. And it's like, no, you don't know that.
Because like I hope, like at some point in the future, hopefully not distant future, like people are going to look back at like the sexuality stuff in like kids shows and be like, what in the world was that generation thinking? Like that, even if some of those ideologies are more normalized, like in the wider culture, like just in children's entertainment, like the fact that you have like shows for like 3-year-olds that are all about like, their sexuality and stuff, like some of those things, I feel like there's going to be a lot of things as people look back on they're going to be like, like, maybe, what in the world was going on there. So there is sort of this sense of I think there's like a hubris of like, hey, we figured it out, so we need to go update the entire history of it to be and I think there also just is like this it's like a fear, like it's like it's a more like consumer mindset of like entertainment should be catered to what we believe. And like that's why I think there's so much like nostalgia and like there's so much sequels and prequels, or it's like
and remakes.
We don't want to like make people uncomfortable with like new things or things that challenge we just need to kind of give them what they know they're okay with. Yeah,
and which is what like all of the social media algorithms try to do is like, oh look, they like puppies, like let's give them lots of puppies. And so I think what that leads to is everyone lives in their own bubble. And so I think when you see people acting out in really bizarre ways to something that they disagree with, it's because like they never have anything they disagree with in their normal life. And so when they're confronted with something that just is completely opposed to their way of life, they freak out about it, because it's like they can live their entire life and not have to like face something that they disagree with.
And I feel like that's where like a lot of the power of that elevates like movies and stuff beyond mere diverting entertainment.
Yeah.
Is in theory like, and I get like kid stuff is a whole different ball game of what you expose. Like, I don't think kids need to be made like out of their comfort zone when they're like 6 to like, here's death and here's sexual things and here's this, like, I think that's a different thing. But that's even why I feel like as a Christian, I don't think it's healthy to like any book and music like is all faith-based stuff that like, isn't a perfectly catered right to what you believe. Like even if you disagree with some of the other stuff, like I feel like it's healthy as a Christian and as a person to see stories told by on different worldviews and pushing things that you don't agree with, and like just to give you that more rounded perspective of the world, rather than just like, hey, anything we have, we need to either change it or just ignore it and only do stuff that we know is gonna like affirm exactly what we kind of comfort. So hey, let us know what you guys think. If you guys agree with Spielberg, again, the guy directed Jaws, so he starts on a higher level with some of that, but I do think he is right, and it is, I think, encouraging. Although maybe it's just all these old directors that seem like they're the ones speaking out against some of this stuff. Yeah. So hey,
well, I think the upside of that is like, yes, it is a bunch of old directors, but they've also like developed the social capital and piggy banks to speak out against these things. Whereas I think a lot of younger directors maybe are less willing to dive into those things because they are still building their careers. And so, hopefully there is still, they are, affecting the next generation of directors, but they may just be less vocal about it now. So who knows?
Yeah. So we'll see what kind of comes from that. Hopefully this doesn't kind of go down the same path as some of like the sensitivity reader thing. Although even that seems like maybe it's thankfully died before it got going too strong. Kind of our last story. Sorry, I wasted my good segue on the last conversation, so I don't have one for this. But kind of another story that we don't need to get into it super in depth, but it was just sort of an interesting, kind of from a Christian perspective, and kind of related to just the power of sort of the arts and it shapes us, but a little more like in-house and not just sort of the cultural stuff. This is an article that my father sent me a little while ago. Which is titled, "There's a Reason Every Hit Worship Song Sounds the Same."
Because it is.
Because it is the same. And this is one of those articles that I in my grumpiness, like, I have issues with a lot of worship songs. I do think they sound the same. And like, I think there's some like tropes and stuff in them that I feel like should go away. But so this article kind of gets into a little bit of that. Like, why does it seem like, and even because we've both played in like worship bands, like musicians, and like, there is a sense that like as a bass player or guitar player, like I can go on a worship band and like a song that I've never heard before and know exactly all the dynamics of it. Like, is this a Hillsong song? Like, I know exactly what the chorus will be like. I know what the bridge will be like, or like the verse. Like, I know we're gonna cut down to a cappella, and then like we're gonna slowly build. We're gonna do it this way. There is sort of these templates that's like, hey, I don't even know this song, but
I know where it's going.
I can play it. I don't need to be told what to do. So there is sort of kind of some of that. But this article kind of gets into kind of some research people kind of looked into, like, is that just that we all feel that way? Like, is it we're all sort of inspired? Or
what's the data?
What's the data? And what they found is that the reason that most of these songs sound the same is because they are all written by the same people. So they kind of pulled kind of like the top 25 most popular songs during like a 10-year period, and found that like all but I think maybe 3 of those songs came from the same 4 like big mega churches, like the same kind of groups of songwriters, and like obviously not necessarily the same person, but like the same
collection of people,
like the same sort of like community, where it's kind of songwriting group, and like they're producing these albums and stuff.
Yeah, I would say it's like the same 4 institutions sort of pumped out all of the top songs. So whether it was like the same writers, but it was like it came from that institution, so it kind of has their stamp on it.
Because even like they go in the article, they kind of go, even some of the ones that didn't come directly from them got like popular, like
They popularized.
yeah, like you know, they didn't write it, but they
We put our spin on it, which is the same spin we put on everything else
yeah,
we've done.
we Hillsongified it and made it into sort of this thing. And the article also kind of gets into at kind of at the very end, which I think is even maybe more interesting. Of like, you know, one, they're all sort of the same because they're the same groups of songwriters, but like sort of the themes and like some of the stuff about those songs that's the same. Like they found like most of them are very like the lyrics of them are very sort of like me centered. Not a whole lot of like references to the cross or to God.
Yeah.
Like it's sort of like what God does for us.
Yeah.
And I have a
Do you remember the Brian Regan bit about the me monster?
very much, you know, me making it all about, because even this is my this, maybe I could have saved this for a host corner, like one of my current, again, I love church, I love worship, a lot of good stuff going on, so caveat
all that said,
like the recent trend with some of these, like that I have such an issue with, like, and like you guys will sort of like the drive-through thing, like you'll notice it now every time you go to church. It's like almost like so many of the new songs you're singing about singing, like it's you're not really singing about God. Like I think it wasn't even maybe a couple of weeks ago I counted like all but one of the songs like in the chorus was like, you know, and we will sing, and we're singing because we're all singing for, like, it's like we're worshiping, but we're actually just like
describing
we're
what
just
it would be like
describing-
if we were.
it's like directed towards what we're doing. Like, you know, we feel good, and we're gonna sing forever. Like we're gonna worship, and it's like what about like who are we worshiping to? Like who is there? Is there more to than just like, you know, we will sing. Like
I'm hearing some amens from the back over there, and I know we have in-house a worship leader. Stephen, did you have anything you wanted to? I heard some grumblings back there. I don't know if that was in agreement or you are gonna put Daniel in his place here.
in which case you won't be back next week.
No, we've actually been teaching students about this, because a lot of the time our worship and response, it's all about me. It's all about God, help me. Instead, it's like, what about the songs that's just like, who is God? Who are we worshiping? And it's like, so we've been actually focused exactly on this subject for a while, of just like leading worship. And I mean, Daniel, you said it, most of the songs that we sing now is, I'm going to sing, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this.
I'm gonna raise my hands.
I'm going to raise my hands and worship. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, sure. Like, there's a time and place for response songs of like, God, like, change me. Like, but I'm like, man, when we're worshiping, we need to be so focused on who God is, like, first, because or else we're just, like you said, we're just saying what would happen if we were worshiping.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just been a running, ongoing thing with us and students currently. So.
Hey, well, I feel validated.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not grumpy. If Steven, who's one of the least grumpy people I know, if he thinks so, then but that is like, because I haven't even thought, and I know church worship is we talked about, I think at some point in the last couple of weeks, like it is primarily, I think, for Christians too. Like it's not necessarily about just sort of like outreach and stuff, but like I've thought, like if someone,
Although some Easter programs would
unless
beg
you're
to
putting
differ.
on, unless you want some like Beyonce pyrotechnics and stuff, like if someone that didn't know anything about God came to like our worship service, didn't stay for the sermon, just to listen to like the music, like what would they know about God? Like what would like what we're singing about? Like it seems like most of what they would hear is stuff that they can just see with their eyeballs. Like, oh, they're singing about how they're gonna sing. Like I can see that, you know. And we are doing so. We are all singing. Like,
Okay, it reminds me of another pet peeve of mine, which is when you use PowerPoint in a presentation and all you do is put your bullet points on the screen and you read your PowerPoint. Like it says to the audience, I don't think you know how to read, so I'm going to read what I have up here. And it's like, well, then what's the point of the PowerPoint? Like, I feel like that's sort of, you know, what's happening is like, yeah, like we can, like, we're going to stand and sing. Like, you don't need to say that. Like, I don't know.
and I do think like, because with that, especially as someone that is a pretty fast reader, like I'm always done the entire thing like before they're even halfway through the first point.
Oh,
It's
it
like,
drives me crazy.
I've
like,
already like processed this, but I do think it does. It is connected to the fact in some ways that like these worship songs like shape our worship and like how we do things, and I do think it is somewhat problematic that like it's such a small community of kind of our Christian church community, capital C church, that is coming up with these songs. Like, I don't think we necessarily think of that when we're picking songs. Like, we just, we like this song, we like this song. But like, sort of the theology and the approach that's like informing these worship songs is like, for like thousands and thousands of Christians are probably like 100 people. And like, you know, there's...
Yeah, if that. I mean, it's probably less than that.
And I think even just like because they become somewhat... And again, I like a lot of these songs too, like Hillsong songs and Bethel songs. There's a lot of good songs that... I don't think all these songs are bad. Maybe the issue is more that like it's just disproportionate that like, you know, hey, a couple of these sprinkled in would be really good, but like when that's all you have, like, and like, especially these hit songs, like I think there is something appealing to, because we feel good about like, we're worshiping and we feel good because we're singing about ourselves and how we're worshiping, and that affirms us. And like,
well, and it's also the structure of the song, and like you're taking people on an emotional journey with how you play the song, and so that very much, I think, dictates how one feels about a particular song. And so if the song hits the right notes at the right time in the right order, you're going to feel great. It really doesn't matter what you're saying, but it's like, because the music goes in this way, it elicits emotions of joy or just happiness or whatever. And so that is almost more powerful than whatever the words are. And you almost don't even necessarily care. And I think most people don't care what the words are, because it's just like, oh, this is such a powerful song. Well, it's powerful because the music in it is structured to make you feel a certain way. It's not powerful because what is being said is either A, just completely false, or B, kind of squishy on like theology, and not to, you know, be the grumpy old man talking about like, that's theologically incorrect, why are we singing that? But it does form, just like with, we've kind of talked about like the Chosen and some of the like Bible movies, that informs theology as well. And so we know that art informs people's theology, and it's not as overt as like a message or a preaching, a sermon, but it will affect and inform how you think and relate to God. And so it is important, the kind of music that you sing.
Yeah, because even like as a parent with young kids that have to do homework every night, like a lot of the same things that we do to help them like have this knowledge and this stuff like sink in can relate to worship song. And like just the act of like singing, the repetitiveness of it. And like, again, I don't think it's necessarily all that it's like the theology is wrong. I just think some of it's misguided or misfocused of like, you know, like we feel like it's a powerful song because it makes us feel good.
Right.
But, like worship isn't powerful because we feel good. Like it's powerful because like we're kind of giving this honest like response to who God is. And like, you know, that it is sort of pointing us that direction, not just like, you know, hey, let's sing about how we're all standing here singing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they mentioned this in the article. I can't remember now, but I would say this is the worship industrial complex. And so I think we can all, you know, do our part to maybe break away from that from time to time, at least.
Yeah, and even I think that I know sometimes I get a bad rap, but I do like when like churches, even smaller, not big mega churches, like come up with their own songs. Like there's sort of more variety in sort of worship, and hey, this is as a community how we, you know, maybe raise up more songwriters beyond just like, hey, these four biggies have been producing good stuff. But hey, let us know. I feel like there's a lot more we could get into, maybe in a live stream in the future, kind of looking more just at sort of worship and some of that more specifically, because we definitely have some thoughts on that. But hey, if you guys have thoughts, let us know. Are we crazy? Are we grumpy? Should we just enjoy it? Or are there some real issues and stuff in there that as a church, even if it's not like a red alert, you know, our faith is, you know, being deteriorated, like still stuff just to be honest about and think about. We'd love to have that conversation with you guys. Kind of final thoughts, things going on. Encourage you guys to check out the article that I wrote on the Mandalorian. Just sort of getting into some of that, sort of how Hollywood talking about faith as Christians. It's kind of interesting thing to look at. Also got some reviews and stuff. It's kind of a crazy week for me, and then I'm out of town next week, so we won't have a live stream next week. So not sure exactly what reviews and stuff or when those will be dropping, but in the next couple of weeks there are some movies and stuff that I hopefully I'll be able to check out. So just stay tuned to this channel and our website for some of that. Like any final deep space-themed wisdom from you, or no?
No, not today.
Well, I mean, was it last week where you left us with everything garden?
Everything garden? That is
I
true.
feel like, is that like the final word? That it's like, you know,
There's nothing else that needs to be.
nothing.
Yeah, well, it does remind me of a quote from a book that I recently read, and I forget the quote now, but it basically it's about the education system in Japan, which
I'm starting to regret.
there's more. But it talked about how in Japanese culture there is this emphasis on teaching kids to tend the world around them, and I think that's just a really sure, there are differences between the American education system and the Japanese, but I think one thing that we can all do better is, take time to tend the world around you, and that can take many forms, but I think it's something to keep in mind.
Because you know what? I feel like everything gardens.
That's true.
So hope you guys, again, you won't be able to join us next week because we won't be here next week, but we'll be here the week after that. So hope you guys will join us for some more cultural conversations. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.